The next unit is HIPAA Security Rule, Threats and Technology Options. In this particular unit, we will be covering the identification of technical and electronic threats to healthcare enterprise and explain the security technology and the electronic protection options that may meet the security rule and privacy rule security provisions and compliance requirements. Next slide. First topic is security threats. Now, what are some of the threats to healthcare organizations? A significant purpose of a sound security management program is to protect against threats that could be related to insufficient documentation, lack of risk analyses, lack of audits, poor management of access control, insufficient authentication both internally and externally, lack of or insufficient training, and so forth. One of the problems with many security programs is they have very significant holes in them. As an example, there are a top 5 areas where in auditing a number of organizations it can be found that, first of all, risk analysis is one of those areas where many organizations have either not conducted one for some time, or what they have conducted has not been very thorough, primarily concentrating on IT assets rather than the whole business. Another area is in the area of audits. There are 4 different types of audits that are required by the HIPAA security rule. 3 of them are periodic audits, and one of them is called an evaluation, or it can also be called a compliance audit. Many organizations do not regularly conduct audits or do not have set criteria that are used that are consistent from one time to another. And another problem is that they have security audit logs turned on that are not looked at, creating a very significant legal risk. Another area that's a problem is in the area of policies and procedures. They're either incomplete, the workforce hasn't been trained on them, they've been out of date, they haven't been regularly reviewed, and so forth. Fourth area is the area of workforce training. Many organizations do provide training for new employees, but they don't provide security reminders as noted in the security rule. They don't provide ongoing training such as an annual refresher course for all employees or workforce members, which is also required by the HIPAA security rule. Another area that's often overlooked is the other part of the workforce, which happens to be temporaries, contractors, and volunteers. In that particular area, even if it's an abbreviated training, that training needs to be conducted because they are officially members of the workforce as defined by both the HIPAA privacy and security rule. And finally is the area of disaster recovery planning and emergency mode operations, where many organizations, their plans are either incomplete or they're outdated or they don't exist. In other cases, there are very good disaster recovery plans, but they only address the technical side of the organization. And as an example, if there's, say, a pandemic, the computers still work, but the business side is in essence shut down because of the lack of staff. So if a disaster recovery plan and emergency mode operations plan don't take into account the business side of the operation as well as the technical side, then they're incomplete and can lead to some significant problems should a disaster occur. Now, security controls, they're a regulatory requirement and an insurance policy. All of the things that I've talked about are controls. They are things to help protect an organization against intrusion, against a threat being realized, a vulnerability being taken advantage of, and so forth. There are regulatory requirements. They all fit under the HIPAA security rule. All standards in the HIPAA security rule must be implemented. All of the implementation specifications must be at the very least evaluated, and they should be implemented unless there's a very, very good reason not to implement them. And it's a good idea to look at security not as a return on investment, because generally security costs money. There is no real return on investment, but what it is it's an insurance policy. It's like a general liability policy, an errors and omissions policy. On the clinical side, it's like a malpractice policy. If you do not have security in place and you do not make that investment that's necessary, then you run the risk of significant damage to your organization, and you also fall into that category of not really providing any privacy of information, because without adequate security, there is no such thing as privacy. Next slide. Now, some other threats to healthcare organizations is covered entities and business associates. They need to determine what those threats and vulnerabilities are to their organization and reasonably ensure safeguards adequately protect against those threats and vulnerabilities. That boils down to a security rule requirement and gets back to what I was talking about as far as insurance. If you do not protect your organization, then you can find significant damage, reputation, damaged equipment, stolen information, lawsuits, and so forth. Threats can come as open or subtle attacks, which should be identified during a sound risk analysis. As an example, a hacker may decide to try to break in through the firewall or do a brute force attack on passwords. Subtle attacks could be something internal, where you have an individual who is colluding with another individual and they steal information for the purpose of identity theft. That's not necessarily going to be openly seen, but if you do not have sufficient controls between, say, somebody who authorizes access to an account or an application versus the person who actually sets up that access, then you have the possibility of an individual with too much authority who has both the ability to authorize and to set up access to various types of areas which may include sensitive information. Now, the risk analysis is a regulatory requirement. It's also the foundation of any solid security program. If an organization does not take a look at what the threats and vulnerabilities are, determine what the risks are as related to what security controls are in place, then it's very difficult to roll out a sound security program because you don't really know what you're protecting yourself against. You may think that your security controls are adequate when through a thorough evaluation you may find that the threats and vulnerabilities that exist are far more damaging and your security controls will not work to stop that damage from occurring. Hence the need for a risk analysis. Next slide. Now, most threats and vulnerabilities are not associated with open attacks against organizations. People are generally the most significant threat to an organization, and most security incident and breaches occur from within an organization. So that means that the necessity for training, the necessity for sound policies and procedures and enforcement, the necessity for sanctions, and to continually monitor to make sure that not only are people trained, but are they following through on the requirements. Oftentimes what occurs is it's not a malicious attack or a threat from inside the organization, it's pure carelessness or the lack of knowledge or ignorance. Now, the risk of external attack, though, should not be minimized, and appropriate security controls will protect against other actions that could result in similar damage related to a direct attack. As an example, if you have an appropriately configured firewall and you are regularly applying the security patches associated with that firewall, as well as monitoring the logs from that firewall, you're less likely to see someone come through or break through that firewall if you are making sure that it is intact, that it has been patched when security patches come out, and it is being monitored. Another example would be your website, to make sure that when you're looking at signing onto the secure portion of your website, that is protected, that you are testing that on a regular basis to make sure that your website is secure and that you issued instructions to those who are logging into that secure portion of your website regarding the makeup of, say, passwords. You can also force that with a website by requiring a certain number of numbers and characters in a password, and it needs to be a certain length. Many organizations do not do that. So that's an area where you would be protecting yourself from an attack from outside. Next slide. Now, attacks are varied. Some of the attacks include denial of service, where you in essence overload the server so that inbound traffic becomes such that it shuts down the server. Spooking or masquerading. It's coming in or appearing to be somebody that is a valid individual. So you're spoofing or masquerading as an individual. DNS spoofing, very similar. There are password cracking applications. As an example, there's one now that used to be a hacker tool, but is not. It's used more and more by mainstream security, and that's called LoftCrack. It's running that application against your passwords to see if you can break those passwords, if they really are strong passwords. This is another reason why if someone is logging in and they attempt to log in using an incorrect login and password, user login and password combination, that after a certain number of times that individual is locked out, because that could be a password cracking application, which if it is allowed to continue to hammer that particular login and password, it will at some point in time likely be able to break through the wall and into the network. That's a very good reason why you want to make sure that after no more than 4 or 5 attempts to log in using an incorrect login and password, that is shut down. Either it is shut down where the individual needs to contact the help desk to reset a password, or it is shut down for a period of time. And that way, if it is a password cracking application, it will stop and it will move on. You have malicious software, which includes viruses, trojans, worms, spyware, and so forth. And spyware is steadily growing. Malicious spyware can be used to capture passwords, they can be used to capture keystrokes and so forth, and broadcast that to a remote place where it can be used to access networks, access protected data, and so forth inappropriately. Originally, spyware was primarily used by merchants to see where someone traveled on the web, or they were used as part of, it wasn't spyware, but it was cookies, and which is what spyware is usually located in, is cookies were used for session-specific applications so that they could help with the appearance and so forth. Now there are a significant number of types of malicious spyware out there that their sole purpose is to capture data, and often they're things like passwords. There's social engineering. An example of social engineering would be an individual takes a step outside the building for a break, a well-dressed individual walks up, starts up a conversation, and they continue that conversation as they walk back into the facility into maybe a restricted area. Now that person has full access to that restricted area. That's an example of shoulder engineering. Phishing is another threat, where someone will set up a website that looks very official, but the primary purpose behind that website is collect confidential information. As an example, asking for your social security number or your bank or credit card number. There are physical attacks, such as theft or a natural disaster. If you are in a high-crime neighborhood, it's probably not a wise idea to line up all of your computers in front of a window that has no curtain, so someone can look in and see those computers. Because even if you have an alarm, someone can walk off with a fair amount of very pricey equipment in short order and evade the police by an in-and-out type of a theft. And then you also, again, have natural disasters. If you're in an area that's prone to tornadoes or prone to earthquakes or prone to floods, you need to put something in place to protect against that natural disaster. These are just examples of some threats that should be readily identified through a regular risk analysis. Next slide. Now there are two different types of things that you can do. There's proactive approach versus a reactive approach. And the security rule includes both. Your risk analysis and risk management, and it would be considered a proactive. And your performance, your periodic and annual audits would be considered reactive. And proactive and reactive activities are required to avoid compliance violations, civil penalties, and monetary settlements, which as an aside have been significantly increased, to avoid PHI breach and also related expense, to identify medical and identity theft before it occurs or as it's occurring, so it can be stopped, and those related expenses such as a lawsuit claiming damages because of identity theft, and of course the civil suits. That is probably one of the more significant areas of risk for an organization. It's not the regulatory penalties, it is the civil suits, where there have been suits for damages over millions of dollars that have been awarded to individuals because of a breach of privacy or a breach of security, where the organization has not demonstrated that they have appropriately followed the HIPAA security rule and that they have not appropriately followed what would be considered appropriate practice. Now, as an aside, an individual cannot sue because it's a HIPAA violation. There is no private right of action under HIPAA, but that does not stop them from suing for damages because of a security breach and, say, after that, identity or medical identity theft. Next slide. Now, the goal of a thorough risk analysis is to, first of all, you inventory and you prioritize assets. And assets are much more than just hardware and software. It includes business processes, data, workforce members, facilities, and so forth. It's to identify what your threats and vulnerabilities are, to catalog and inventory those, and to evaluate how much of a threat they are, how much of a vulnerability exists. You evaluate your security controls against those threats and vulnerabilities. Do the security controls you have in place really protect you against those threats and vulnerabilities that you've identified? Then you determine the cost. How much is it going to cost me if a threat is realized? What's the likelihood that that is going to occur? And then, based on the likelihood of your threats and vulnerabilities and the cost to the organization, and looking at your existing security controls, you're going to evaluate your risks. And you're going to evaluate whether it's high, medium, or low, and you may have some gradations in between. But basically, the bottom line is, okay, if it's a high risk, something needs to happen, and it needs to happen now. If it's a medium risk, you likely want to take some action, but it is not necessary to take immediate action against that. But you do need to develop the mitigation plans that document the fact that you are not willing to accept the risk, that you will be doing something about the risk, and how long it will take for you to address that. You also may elect to accept the risk. If a risk is low, it's going to be a low threat to the organization, and it's low cost if it does occur, then you may document the fact that you are willing to accept the risk and the reasons why. Now, when you get into the mitigation phase, you do need to have plans with budgets and so forth, and you need to follow those plans. If those plans do not appear workable, you need to adjust them, and you need to document that. And you need to document processes and results. That's both documenting when a risk has been mitigated, but it's also documenting the fact that you're willing to accept certain risks and why you're willing to accept those risks. Next slide. Now, the end goal of periodic audits are to assist with risk management, to identify potential threats and vulnerabilities based on those audit findings, to address audit findings that identify existing security-related problems and issues, to identify malicious or inappropriate activity and impose associated sanctions, to fix noted problems and issues timely, and to demonstrate due diligence. As periodic audits happen on a more than annual basis, they should happen at least monthly, and there are 3 different types of audits that should occur at least monthly. One of them is the Information Systems Activity Review, and that is more the IT department looking at the IT functions to make sure that patches are being applied appropriately, that antivirus and anti-spyware software is being updated appropriately, and so forth. The next one is user login monitoring, and it serves 2 purposes. One is to log or to view when individuals are attempting to access the network or applications using incorrect login and password, and they attempt to do that maybe more than once, but it's looking at invalid attempts to access assets of the organization, such as the network and applications. It's also the final periodic audit that needs to be conducted is an audit log. It's where an audit log will be generated, say, out of the electronic medical record or out of the claims system, and it's looking at those logs to determine whether or not inappropriate activity is occurring, if someone is attempting to access data that they shouldn't be accessing. Next slide. Now, the end goal of the evaluation or compliance audit, which is your annual audit, and as an aside, that should occur annually or whenever any major system or business changes occur. It's looking at risk management. It's looking at your complete security program. It's a program assessment. It's reasonably ensuring that policies, procedures, your disaster recovery and emergency mode operations plan, your training material, and so forth is up to date. It's regularly reviewed, it's accurate, and it's enforceable. It's identifying your security gaps and controls. is determining if identified mitigation activities during your risk analysis have actually been addressed. And it's evaluating compliance with new statutes and regulations, be they federal or state. So it's a process of looking back over the year and looking at normal activities that should be occurring, making sure that they are occurring, and if they're not, then noting that in the audit report so then a mitigation plan for that can also be developed.